Ex Corde Caritas, the Watsonian Roll of Honour for the First World War, 1914 to 1918. John Adams, Robert Affleck, John Ainsley, William Ainsley, John Aitchison, Scott Aitchison, William Aitken, William Aiton, John Alexander Elliot Alexander, John Petrie Alexander, Thomas Alexander, Arthur Allen, Charles Allen, William Allen, Frederick Allison, James Allison, Alexander Anderson, David Anderson, Frederick Kinloch Anderson, Frederick William Anderson,
James Anderson, Walter Kinloch Anderson, Walter Zerub Bailey Anderson, Napier Arnott, Henry Armstrong, John Ashcroft, Dermot Bailey, Archibald Bain, Albert Baker, Alfred Baker, Roy Balmain, Charles Banks, William Barber, Marshall Barclay, William Barry, Thomas Bartleman, William Bartleman, Andrew Baxendine, John Baxendine, Henry Barnett,
William Beatty from Beetle, Alfred Bell and Charles Bell, David Bell, John Gibson Bell,
John Murray Black and John Murray Bell and James Muir Black.
James Black, William Black, William Blackhall, Andrew Blair, John Blake, Robert Blythe, John Bone, William Bonner, James Bohill, John Bowie, Jack Bremner, Alan Bremner,
Archibald Bridges, Hugh Broadway, Neville Broadway, Alexander Brown, Arnold Brown, George Brown, George Brownlee Brown, James Brown, William Gordon Brown, William Nimmo Brown, George Brown, William Brownlee, George Bruce, Vincent Bruce, Tom Bryden, Robert Bryson, Leslie Buchan, John Budge, Joseph Burns, William Burt,
William Bush, James Booty, James Byers, Robert Cadsell, Ernest Caird, William Cairns, Alexander Calder, William Calderwood, James Alistair Gordon Cameron, James Ritchie Cameron, Robert Cameron, William Cameron, Donald Campbell, William Campbell, Duncan Cargill, Francis Carlton, William Chisholm, Dougald Christie, William Christie, Charles Clark.
George Mackay Clark, George Murray Clark, Smollett Clark, George Cochrane, Lan Cochrane, Cecil Coyles, Daisy Coyles, Lionel Coyles, John Considine, Patrick Considine, Cecil Cook, Robert Copland, James Cooper, Robert Coots, Lewis Cowan, Neil Cowan, Archibald Cow, William Cowie, Robert Craig, George Cranston.
William Crawford, Donald Crerar, Charles Crichton, James Crichton, Austin Crowe, John Crockett, William Crombie, James Craig, John Cullen, Charles Cunningham, Hugh Cunningham, John Cunningham, Adam Curry, Robert Curry, Neil Darker, Walter Davies, John Davison, William Davison, Reginald Dawson.
Lancelot Dean, William Deese, James Dick, Ernest Dingwall, Harry Dippy, George Dobie, William Dobie, James Doig, Alexander Don, Fred Don, Archie Donaldson, John Dougal, Charles Douglas, Ronald Ross Douglas, William Douglas, John Dowell, Robert Drummond, William Drummond, James Dudgeon, Charles Duggan.
John Duncan, William Duncan, David Dunn, Willoughby June, Christian Dunlop, Ronald Easterbrook, Arthur Edmondson, Edward Elliot, James Elliot, Joan Hare Fairgrave, Alexander Fairley, William Fairley, William Falconer, Roderick Ferguson, George Fleming, James Fleming, Christopher Flynn, Leslie Forbes, Charles Ford, George Ford.
Archibald Forrest, Bertram Forrest, James Forrester, Herbert Forrester, Rutherford Fortune, Herbert Fraser, Malcolm Fraser, Edwin Fry, Andrew File, William Gull, Herbert Gammy, John Gallatley, Robert Gallatley, Alexander Gemmell, William Gemmell, James Gerard, Robert Gerard, Alexander Gibb, Arthur Gibb, George Gibson.
Reginald Gibson, Robert Gibson, Douglas Gillespie, Andrew Gilson, David Gilmore, Charles Glegg, William Good, Alexander Gorey, James Gorey, Samuel Gover, Ian Gowan, James Graham, James Grant, Percy Grant, Benjamin Gray, Charles Gray, David Gray, Francis Gray, James Greenhorn, Ronald Gunn. William Gunn, George Guthrie, John Haddle, John Haggard, Arthur Holding, John Hamilton, Thomas Hamilton, Alexander Hare, Frederick Harley, Herbert Tartley, Aubrey Hawkes, John Hay, Robert Hay, David Henderson, James Henderson, Ralph Hendry, Oswald Hurd, Bernard Hereford, Geoffrey Hereford, David Heron.
John Hill, Robert Hogg, Herbert Honeyman, James Hood, Thomas Hood, Hugh Hobbs, Henry Horrocks, Alfred Erskine, George Erskine, George Harrison, James Huggin, Henry Huey, William Hume, David Hunter, George Hunter, George Arnold Hunter, Harry Hunter, Moram Hunter, William Hunter, Harry Hutchison.
Frederick Hislop, James Inch, Robert Inch, Maurice Inglis, John Ingram, Charles Iles, David Jack, Guy Jack, John Jackson, James Jackson, Alexander Jameson, Crawford Jameson, Arthur Jardine, James Johnston, Robert Jolly, Alexander K, George K, John K, James Kearney, George Kelly Lawson. Charles Kemp, James Kemp,
James Wallace Kennedy, James Gordon Kennedy, Malcolm Kerr, David Kerr, David Chesney Kerr, Henry Kerr, Robert Kilpatrick, Alexander Knox, Frank Hyde, James Laidlaw, Hugh Laird, John Lamb, Frank Lawrence, James Lawrence, William Lawson, John Leckie, George Lees, David Leeton.
Ernest Lade, Charles Lindsay, William Linklater, Thomas Lockie, Robert Logan, Edward Longdon, Norman Lutheran, Francis Love, William Lowe, William Lawson, William Luca, John Lyburn, James Lyell, George McAllister, William Macbeth, John McDermott, Angus MacDonald, Arthur MacDonald, Malcolm MacDonald, Somerled MacDonald.
Ian McFarlane, William Cargill Stewart McFarlane, William Smith McFarlane, William Walter McFarlane, Donald Argyle Douglas Ian McGregor, Donald Hamilton McGregor, James McKindle, Ian Mackay, Mark Mackay, David Mackenzie, John Mackenzie, Robert Mackenzie, Reginald Mackey, William Mackey, Edward McIntosh, Angus MacLeod, Ian MacLeod, James McMaster, James McMeekan, Archibald McPherson.
Robert McPherson, Robert Duncan Burns McPherson, Duncan McRae, Lewis McRae, Murdoch McTaggart, Herbert Mays, Arthur Mann, John Martin, Ross Martin, George Marwick, William Masterton, James Mabin, Clement MacArthur, Archibald McCall, Donald McCallum, Duncan McCall, George McRae, Charles McCrosty, Edward McDougall, George McEwen.
Arthur McGregor, Donald McGregor, James McIntyre, Douglas MacLeod, Henry MacLeod, William McRae, David McCrither, Norman McCreary, James McTavish, David Stewart McGregor, Charles Meister, Ernest Meldrum, James Melrose, David Melville, Harry Melville, Archibald Menzies, Norman Mill, Alexander Miller, George Ingalls Miller, George William Miller.
Archibald Miller, John Miller, Robert Miller, Thomas Miller, William Miller, Robert Milne, Eric Milroy, Reginald Minto, Douglas Mitchell, John Mitchell, Norman Mitchell, Robert Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell, Ian Molyneux, James Monker, William Monker, James Monroe, Eric Moore, Archibald Morrison, Eric Morrison,
James Morris, Alexander Morrison, James Bow Morrison, James William Morrison, John Morrison, Andrew Moore, James Muir, George Muir, Henry Mulligan, Alexander Murray, James Andrew Murray, James Brash Murray, Robert Murray, George Naismith, David Nichol, William Nicholson, Adam Nimmo, John Nisbet, Pollock Nisbet, John Niven,
John O'Sullivan, John Orme, George Overton, Alexander Park, Archibald Park, Norman Patterson, Francis Patrick, Hugh Pattison, James Pearson, John Peaty, Charles Peden, David Peffers, Ellis Pitcairn, William Porteous, William Henry Gray Porteous, James Prentice, Charles Price, Owen Price, Arthur Pringle, Douglas Pritchard,
George Purves, Albert Piper, George Rain, Charles Rayson, Alexander Raitt, John Ramsey, Ernest Rankin, John Rankin, Donald Reed, Robert Reed, John Rennie, Thomas Angus Ridgely, John Ritchie, Louis Ritchie, Richard James Wallace Ritchie, Robert Ritchie, Alexander Robertson, Athol Robertson, John Robertson, Lennox Robertson,
William Robertson, James Rogerson, George Ronaldson, John Ronaldson, William Rose, William Moore Rose, Harry Rosenblum, Alexander Ross, Finlay Ross, James Ross, Ian Russell, William Russell, Robert Rutherford, William Sadler, Alexander Sanderson, Robert Scarlett, Charles Sclater, Henry Scott, Alexander Scougal, Frank Scougal.
James Selkirk, Howard Seaton, Ian Shannon, James Shaw, John Shaw, Tom Shaw, William Shaw, William Shepherd, William Sheriff, Harry Shortreed, James Sidey, William Skinner, Thomas Skirvin, John Slater, Gordon Smart, Adam Smith, Alexander Smith, James Smith, John Smith, Lawrence Smith.
Sidney Smith, William Smith, John Southern, Andrew Spears, Robert Square, Robert Steele, William Steele, Herbert Stenhouse, James Stewart, Frederick Stevenson, John Stevenson, Tom Stevenson, Alexander Stewart, Douglas Stewart, George Stewart, Ralph Stewart, Tudor Stobby, Robert Alexander Stewart, William Stewart, Robert Graham Stewart.
Charles Sutherland, John Sutherland, George Swan, Robert Swan, David Sword, George Sy, Ian Taylor, Thomas Taylor, William Templeton, Frederick Fallon, John Fallon, Alexander Thompson, Charles Thompson, George Thompson, John Thompson, Patrick Thompson, Robert Thompson, William Thompson, William Thompson, James Thorburn,
William Thorburn, Henry Turnbull, Ernest Turner, Joseph Turner, Alexander Urquhart, William Urquhart, Claude Van Summeren, Robert Vickers, Lionel Vinico, George Wade, George Waldy, David Walker, John Walker, William Wallace, Clement Walter, Alistair Watson, Norman Watson, Robert Watson, William Erskine Watson, William J. Watson. Percy Watt, James Waters,
Harold Matthews, William Webster, Robert Wedderburn, Jack Weatherspoon, Robert Weir, William Weir, Thomas Welsh, Robert Westwater, Alexander Westwood, George White, James Whitelaw, Charles Whitaker, Marshall White, Reginald Wilkes, Archibald Wilson, Arthur Wilson, Conrad Wilson, Gordon Wilson.
Henry Wilson, James Wilson, John Wilson, Lewis Wilson, Matthew Wilson, Robert Armstrong Wilson, Robert Forsyth Wilson, Robert Stratton Wilson, Frank Windle, James Wingate, James Wood, James Wiper, Andrew Young, Andrew George Young, Archibald Young, David Young, George Young, James Young, John Young, William Young. We will remember them. Welcome to our 2018 Remembrance Service.
Service of remembrance at the War Memorial, which we have just observed, commemorates all those former pupils from George Watson's College who gave their lives in the service of their country during the wars of the 20th century. A piper played a lament, the flowers of the forest, and a bugler sounded the last post and reveille. This has been done for many years. We shall now sing the hymn, Abide With Me. The chamber choir will sing the first verse, then all join in. Please stand.
sit. This year marks 100 years since the end of World War I. It also marks our 100th Remembrance Service since November 1919. On that occasion, the school community gathered to commemorate the 599 former pupils who had given their lives in the Great War. In a roll call this morning, the names of the fallen were read out by pupils and staff from across the whole school, from the nursery to S6. There were so many, the roll call lasted over half an hour. In this way, we honoured the school's promise every year to remember them.
The first former pupil to die in combat was John Crockett. John was born in 1886 and attended Watson's from 1896. He left to study medicine at Edinburgh University in 1903. After several years working as a doctor, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1913, serving with the Cameron Highlanders in Edinburgh Castle. At the outbreak of war, his battalion went to France, where he was killed during the Battle of the Aisne on the 14th of September, 1914. He was 28 years old.
The First World War was fought on land, at sea, and in the air, using weapons never seen before. Hugh James Hobbs was born in 1887 and arrived at Watson's in February 1902, aged 14. He was a member of the Literary Society and played in the Second 15. Like John Crockett, he studied medicine at Edinburgh University. He spent a few years working in hospitals and at sea before joining the Royal Navy on HMS Pembroke.
At the start of the war, he became a surgeon on the HMS Aboukir, a cruiser built in Govan and launched in 1900. By 1914, it was obsolete and had been out of action for 2 years before being called back into service. On the 22nd of September, it was on patrol of the Dutch coast, lying abreast with its two sister ships, the Cressy and the Hogue. The ships were manned mostly by reservists and jokingly referred to as the Live Bait Squadron. A storm the night before had driven off their escorting destroyers.
The lookouts were unable to spot the U-boat U9 before one of its torpedoes struck the Aboukir at 6:20 a.m. The ship's captain thought he'd struck a mine, and in the effort to evacuate the Aboukir's crew, the Hogue was struck as well. The Aboukir sank at 6:55 a.m. An hour later, all three ships had been sunk. Hugh Hobbs was one of the 527 men from the Aboukir who perished in this attack. He was 27 years old and the third former pupil to die in the war.
James Pearson, known as Peary, was looking forward to a great future. Born on the 24th of February 1888, he was a pupil at Watson's from 1896 to 1907. Peary was short, round-shouldered and light, which made his sporting success even more remarkable. He was an outstanding cricketer, rugby player and all-round sportsman. In 1907, he was declared school champion. Today, His picture looks down from above the bar at Myerside.
After leaving school, Peary played for Watsonians, scoring an almost unbelievable 113 tries, plus a total of 338 points in a golden age when Watsonians were Scottish champions over 4 seasons. He was then chosen to play 12 matches for Scotland. In 1914, Peary joined the Watsonian Military Training Corps. The idea of a Watson's Pals Battalion did not work out, so he joined the 9th Royal Scots, known as the Dandy 9th because they wore the kilt.
On the night of the 22nd to 23rd of May 1915, the 9th were in Sanctuary Wood in the Ypres salient. During the previous weeks, they had suffered massive casualties and were about to be pulled out of the line to recover. In a quiet moment, tea was suggested, but the water around them was stagnant. "Well, boys," said Peary, "I'll away and get some fresh water," and he waded down the trench. 3 minutes later, he was hit by a sniper's bullet. The site of Peary's grave was lost due to heavy shelling, but in 1930, his body was found. During half-term, 70 pupils on the battlefields trip visited his grave.
Douglas Victor Gillespie was born in 1897 and attended Watson's from 1908 to 1915. He suffered from ill health and was often absent, but became a member of the Cadet Corps. In 1916, he was studying to become a vet when he enlisted in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps. He transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, where he completed his training and was gazetted second lieutenant in February 1918. He saw some stirring fighting in France and proved himself an intrepid airman. He was said to have been shot down by Baron Manfred von Richthofen, the world-famous Red Baron. He was killed instantaneously on 6th of April 1918.
Arthur James Hamish Mann was born on the 5th of April 1896 and started at Watson's in June 1903, aged 8. He lived at the Red House on the corner of South Gilsland Road. A heart condition kept him in poor health, so he left in November 1912 until he recovered. He finished his education with the help of a tutor. He assisted at Craigleith Military Hospital and was joint editor of the hospital newspaper, writing under the name of Lucas Cap. In August 1915, he joined the Royal Highlanders and took part in the Battle of the Somme. During his time on the front lines, he continued writing as poet and journalist. On the opening day of the Battle of Arras, 9th of April 1917, Hamish was wounded and died the following day.
"3 days before the attack, he penned his last and most famous poem, The Great Dead. Some lie in graves beside the crowded dead in village churchyards. Others shell holes keep, their bodies gaping, all their splendour sped. Peace, O my soul, a mother's part to weep. Say, do they watch with keen all-seeing eyes my own endeavours in the whirling hell? Ah, God, how great, how grand the sacrifice. Ah, God, the manhood of yon men who fell. And this is war, blood and a woman's tears, brave memories adown the quaking years." The chamber choir will now sing John Taverner's setting of the poem, The Lamb, by William Blake.
Willie Brown, known as Seggy to his friends, was born on the 12th of August, 1895, and attended Watson's from 1904 to 1914. He was a quiet, good-humoured and popular pupil, chosen to be a senior office bearer and elected treasurer of the Literary and Debating Society. He was also a first-class shot and rangefinder, earning him a promotion to colour sergeant in the cadets. When war broke out, instead of studying at Edinburgh University, he joined the 4th Battalion Royal Scots. In 1915, he was wounded at Gallipoli and sent home. Before he recovered, he insisted on joining another infantry unit. He was killed on the 13th of November, 1916. Seggy had been a mathematical genius who continued his studies in the trenches. His last work was placed before the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1922. He had arrived independently at the same calculations as Albert Einstein. Einstein lived until he was 76. Seggy was killed when he was just 21.
David Stuart McGregor was born in 1895 and joined Watson's in October 1900, aged 5. He left in July 1908 after S1 due to changes in home circumstances and attended George Heriot School. He was commissioned and served as a lieutenant in the Royal Scots. He fought near Hoogmolen on the 22nd of October 1918, commanding a section of machine guns. As his battalion attacked, he led a platoon on the right flank of the assault. Immediately, they were subjected to intense machine gun fire from a hill on the right flank.
Alone, Lieutenant McGregor advanced and located the long line of enemy gunners. He saw it was impossible for his men to move their field guns. The ground was absolutely bare, and there was nowhere to hide from the machine gun fire. He ordered his men to take a more covered route. He mounted the ammunition cart and ordered the driver forward. They galloped under intense fire for about 600 yards until they reached cover.
The driver, horses, and cart were all hit, but Lieutenant McGregor succeeded. He got the guns into action, effectively engaging the enemy, subduing their fire, and enabling the battalion to continue its assault. He continued to direct and control the fire of his guns until, about an hour later, he was killed. His citation for the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross recorded that his great gallantry and supreme devotion to duty were the admiration of all ranks.
A Watsonian, R.R. Bryden of South Africa, was instrumental in bringing the 2-minute silence into the armistice commemorations. This is now used in British and Commonwealth ceremonies around the world. At the first Watson's Remembrance Day in November 1919, the drum corps of the pipe band signalled the start of the minute silence by sounding through the corridors where once had trod the feet of carefree boys. We will now recreate that moment. At the end of the minute silence, a piper will play Reveille. We now ask you to stand until requested once again to sit. Please stand.
They shall grow, not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.